Welcome to the Endless Knot Podcast,
where the more we know,
the more we want to find out,
tracing serendipitous connections through our lives
and across disciplines.
Hi, I'm Aven.
And I'm Mark.
And today we have a very special episode for you. We've just been at the SoundEducation conference in Harvard. We mentioned that we were going to be going to it. And at that conference, we had a fabulous time. We also took some time to do a couple of interviews.
With other podcasters.
Exactly. So the first one is what we're going to play today, or at least part of this episode is that. We sat down and talked with Ryan of the History of Ancient Greece podcast. We had a conversation there for about 20 minutes.
But of course, it was a very full, packed 2 days, so we didn't get as much time as we wanted to record.
Yes, we had to give up the room because it was time for the next session. Mm-hmm. So we picked up again a couple of days after we got home remotely, and we mentioned that when we get to that bit. And then during that recording session, as we were talking about the conference, we had some small technical difficulties and the recording dropped and started again. So there's another sort of odd moment in between. So we're going to play all of this for you. Basically, it's a debrief of the conference and a description of what happened. We hope it's interesting. If you weren't able to come to this conference about educational podcasting, or if you were able to come but only were able to see some of the sessions, we can maybe report on some of them. And maybe it'll whet your appetite for coming to the conference again next year, because we've been told.
It's going to happen.
We're not sure of dates or anything yet, but of course we'll announce that when it happens. So enjoy. Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Would you like some frightening blue drink?
Sure.
All right.
I never turn down alcohol.
Yeah. So this is a bit of the booze that we're going to have for our live show, live presentation, whatever it is we're doing this afternoon. I still don't know how that's going to go. So, cheers.
What is it called?
It's called a Blue Moon.
Oh, okay.
Doesn't make a nice clinking sound with these glasses.
No, these are our camping cocktail glasses.
We are that committed to cocktails that we bring cocktail
Glasses camping. I literally got them out of our camping cup.
With the weather, we should have done something stormy-related drinking.
Yeah, that's true.
Something rain.
What is in this?
So it's gin and blue curacao.
Okay.
Hence the blue.
Sort of orange.
It's not. I mean, it's quite sweet, and it's the blue curacao in particular. I tasted a little bit before I put it in. It's really, really cheap blue curacao and quite expensive, nice gin. Mm-hmm. So we've totally ruined the good gin, because I wanted to try the good gin because it was like, oh, that's a gin I've never tried before.
Well, I mean, it's good because I don't usually drink gin, so the fact that it's good gin means I can't really taste how bad I think gin is.
Well, it's mostly tasted the blue curacao. But so anyway, so yes, this is blue because we're going to be talking about colors later on. So we wanted something colorful.
I'm excited for that.
Mm-hmm. She says, spilling stuff all over herself. So, how's the conference been?
It's been a lot.
No, it really has been.
I was struggling yesterday because I didn't have enough time to go get my afternoon coffee, and I was like, oh, it's just like everything going on. I've been learning so much because when we do, at least me, when I do podcasting, I'm like, I improve on my podcast, but it's just mistakes that I make. Like I don't.
You only have feedback from your own feedback loop.
Yeah, so I don't see what really other people are doing. I mean, you can see what they're doing by listening to them. But that's not the same.
You see what they're putting out, but you don't see what they're putting in, and you don't see how their process works, and
I haven't quite digested it all to see what improvements I'll make on mine yet. That'll be something that'll come when I reflect later, because I'm just now like a sponge, kind of.
Yeah.
Brain starting to hurt. But the panel's been really good. The classics panel that I was on yesterday morning was really fun. In the future, we'll probably do more of a conversation, but it's the first conference. So
we're all figuring out how this is working and what the formats were.
We're the guinea pigs.
What makes sense, yeah.
The four of us, it was Lantern Jack from Ancient Greece Declassified, Rhiannon Evans of Emperors of Rome, myself, and Zoe Contis of Ludit Podcast. And we all basically just talked about how our project started, how we've improved with them, lessons learned, and methodology. And it just ended up being like each person talking for about 15 minutes or so. And it was a lot different than, say, you guys' where it was more of like questions and everybody answered. I think that format might have been a little better for what we were doing, but we were first one in the morning, and
Yeah,
we
yeah.
were just the first time. So
And it's hard to know because none of us knew, I think, what our audiences would be, or whether there would be any, or how many people were going to be there, or what they would want to know. Like, this hasn't happened before. It's an academic conference, but it's also a podcasting conference. And that's, I mean, I'm not saying there's been none of that yet, but not a lot of it.
Yeah.
And so I think we all felt coming in, I don't know what this is going to be. Like, we didn't, when we did our first one yesterday, so we did Professors Who Podcast as the first one, and I was moderating it. And sort of walked in and thought, I don't know, like, it might just be the panel. And not because I thought it wasn't interesting, but because I didn't know how many people were attending. I didn't know how many people beyond the people who were on the panels were coming, like how many people were coming who weren't presenting. And also, I don't know, are most of the people who are here in academia, or are almost none of the people here in academia? And if you weren't, maybe you wouldn't come to this panel, right?
Well, the Professors Who Podcast panel was probably people
I
in
know,
academia.
but like at the conference, are there very many other people here who are
Today.
professors? You know, that's yesterday. I didn't know. I mean, it turns out yes, there are, but I just didn't know. So as it turned out, we had a full house, and it was great. And
there was a lot of questions and interaction with the people who just came to the
so I sort of started off by asking questions of the panel, and everybody gave a few minutes talk from like just introducing themselves. But then people just started leaping in with questions, and the conversation went lots of different ways, which was great. It does mean that I had a whole bunch of other questions I wanted to ask that I didn't get to ask. I mean, everything that went on was good. It's not like it was a distraction, but I was left going, but we can't be done yet because I have these things I want to know yet. Because the questions I wanted to ask were not really questions that I just thought were good discussion. They were genuine questions I had for other professors who podcasted. Like, I want to know your answers. Like, I want to be able to take this information back. So I've already said to several people that if this happens again next year, which I think we all really hope it does,
for sure.
that I would love to be involved in like setting up a track of a series of roundtables, sort of addressing all the questions we didn't get to, and some of the ones we got to but didn't, because I think there was just so much to talk about how to be a professor who podcasts, why you should, what makes it hard, how to use podcast in class, how to use podcasting in class. Like, a lot of the people on the panel have their students make a podcast episode as part of an assignment, but that's a whole thing too. Like, how do you do that? Like, I wanted to talk about, but we never got to, the mechanics of that. What kind of thing do you ask them to do? How do they do it? What equipment do they use?
I met a professor, I forget what department she's in, this morning, but at Northwestern, and she teaches a class that teaches students how to make podcasts.
Yes.
So
I think she was probably there yesterday.
Yes.
And I didn't get anybody's names.
I wish I had that class because, I started and made almost every mistake possible in the first 4 or 5 months. I mean,
exactly.
that would have been great to know.
Yeah,
I mean,
just to leapfrog some of those basic issues at the beginning. You still have to work your own kinks out for your own stuff. But this is it. Several of the people on the panel are in or associated with digital media programs at their university. So if your university has a digital media department, then you teach those classes, and that's great and that's amazing. But then some of them also don't, but still have their students do podcasting. So then that's where we would be, because we don't have a digital medias department. There's no particular on-campus studio or anything like that. But we've both given an option of a podcast episode to students as a final project for classes we've taught. But it's just an option, and one of the reasons it's only an option is because...
Is anyone taking you up on that yet?
Yeah. I've had a couple of people...
Are they published, or are they
no,
just like
they were just individual
MP3s that were sent to you?
We shared them with the rest of the class. Like, for both of us, this is the same course, really, that we both taught. And the point there is that they have to produce something that can be shared with everybody else. They can be posted online so that everyone else in the class can see it.
I would hope that they at least personally put it on a blog or something.
Well, we had a course. We had a course blog. We had a course. I don't know what they did with it afterwards, but they were very the ones that made it for me were very like course specific. I don't know that they would have been. It was just one episode and one thing, but that's part of the thing. Wouldn't it be nice to actually have students produce something that was a piece that could be shared with the wider public and would make sense to them?
Were they all different topics?
Yeah.
You could do a classroom podcast and put all their episodes and like one little thread sort of thing.
Well, if you were going to...
If everybody does.
If you were going to do the podcast, then you could then string them together into a series.
Yeah, well, so that's what I'd love to do that sometime in a class, like sort of say, and maybe over the course of the class, because you could do, you can do it like a 5 or 10 minute episode. It doesn't have to be big and long.
Yeah.
So you could
That's
totally,
what Dan Carlin said today. It's like podcasting is you can do whatever you want, and you're not beholden to anyone. Obviously, they would be beholden to what you're...
Yeah,
actually, it's a little different. They'd be beholden to what you tell them they can and cannot do.
But we could choose any limits that would make sense for the class. And we could, and somebody could do longer episodes if they wanted, but we could, I always try to make it as unintimidating as possible for a student. And
you're not going to tell them to make a 6-hour episode from the jump.
Yeah, and it has to have music, and it has to have, But, you could do something in a class where, for instance, instead of, because I get students to do blog posts on for several of my classes, you could instead build it in where it wasn't just a final project, but where along the way, one student had to produce one episode per week, like a student per week had to do an episode that was, a summary of an article or a response to a reading, or you have set questions, whatever. And then those get strung together, and then that goes up. And then the next time you teach that course, that's part of your teaching material. Like now the next students listen to that and then do their own something else. But all of that needs scaffolding. Like if you're going to ask the whole class to do it, you have to give them equipment and resources to do it. Even if it's very, very basic, there has to be somewhere. You can't just say, go off and do it, figure it out for yourself, So this is the kind of stuff I'd really love to talk about in much more depth. And we touched on it, but we just didn't have time to talk about a lot of it. But it was still really cool to hear from other professors and what they're doing.
And it's kind of along that same vein, I wasn't sure how formal or informal this was going to be. And it seems it's a combination of both. But because I wasn't sure, because podcasting itself is pretty informal.
Yeah,
I mean, there are professional podcasters, and that's not informal. And they're represented here as well. But for the vast majority of podcasts, they're pretty informal. And then we're doing a conference at one of the most hallowed institutions in America.
At the Divinity School.
At the Divinity School. So I wasn't sure what to expect.
What that meant.
Yes, I was
it's a Harvard conference.
Yeah.
Does that mean, are there Harvard conference rules? I mean, I don't even know what those rules would be, but are there? Or is it a podcasting conference? And
so you're taking something that's intuitively informal because it's a do-it-yourself project.
Especially for those of us who are independent.
Exactly. And then you're at this such formal institution. And then I think the combination of it has some kinks, no doubt, but I think this is going to work out if they keep with it.
Yeah, I think
I've learned
quite good.
lot so far, and just the community in general, just meeting new people. I mean, I don't listen to a whole lot of non-history podcasts that are but
that
I've met a lot that I'm like,
yeah.
well, they're on the list eventually. Like science podcasts. I'm like, that is interesting.
Actually, science podcast is something I don't have. The only thing I listen to
Zero.
is Quirks and Quarks, which is a CBC radio program, but they said to put it out as a podcast. That's the only science I have, really. No, that's not true. I also listen to one called PH Drinking, where someone interviews PhD students. Now, they aren't only in science, but she's in science, so she has a tendency to talk, and she interviews them about their work, and they have a drink. So, as you can see, I obviously approve of that as a style. So I do listen to that, but that's the only other one I think that I listen to that's routinely science-based.
I used to listen to a few.
Yeah.
But
I would...
I think I'm still am listening to any.
Yeah, so that would be something I wouldn't mind filling in a little bit.
I can give you the list of the ones that I found that might be interesting.
Yeah, I've seen
I
I've seen a
can't remember
couple.
them. I just wrote them
the
down.
Science Odyssey, of course, is the one that you introduced us to, the person who does that, and that's
Chad
history
Davies.
of science, and that is totally in my wheelhouse.
Actually,
So-
that I would really like to add that.
It's the history of science and the history of scientific thought. So, and the philosophy behind it. So it's both scientific and historical. Very good. Chad Davies does that. There's a few others that I've learned about this. Like there's an astronomy podcast.
Yeah, Astronomy Cast, I think. Yeah. Cool. But yeah, and I just like meeting the people. I like meeting the people that I already know.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
I like meeting the people that I don't know.
People that you know virtually. It's really cool.
Yeah.
I don't think I have actually. Okay, so I think there's 2 people here that are podcasters that I've ever met in real life.
Right.
Doug, I've met Doug Metzger of Literature and History, and Rob Sims of History in the Making.
And everybody else you only knew
Everybody else I
online.
knew from Twitter or Facebook, and it's really cool to put a face, an actual face to the images
voice.
you might see or the voice, and communicate with them in person, and just the communities together, because podcasting, and Doug talked about this a little bit in his keynote speech yesterday morning. Podcasting is such a very lonely endeavor, because it's just you're teaching, but you're not. There's no interacting.
You don't get the feedback. Yeah,
especially I mean, you guys at least have each
Yeah,
other.
yeah.
Especially me. I'm literally here with a microphone, and I have my dog by my foot.
And that's your only audience.
Yeah, and I'm just talking into the mic. I'm sure my neighbors think I'm a weirdo because nobody ever responds to my anything I say.
You're having a conversation.
Yeah, I'm having a
Talking
conversation. So it's a very lonely endeavor, and then you spend hours upon hours just editing what you're doing with your with your headphones in your on your head. So it's cool to come together and not only just learn from people, but just to see. The
way
community,
other people are doing things.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the highlights for me so far was just going out to dinner last night, and I knew it would be because it always is. Like meeting people and talking with people at any conference, all academic conferences for me, it's always about seeing people. That's I mean, you do the learning, and the learning is good, but seeing and meeting and just sitting around last night and like you share the things that bother you or the things that are hard or the things that are fun, and someone else at the table says, oh yeah,
I've had
totally. That's so like
whatever.
I had this happen. That's the same, and you think, oh, good.
Not
Okay.
just me.
Yeah, not just me.
I'm not screwing everything up.
Yeah,
Actually,
I'm not just making it all mess up, or my audience isn't the only one that thinks X, or
Everyone has the same foibles, I suppose.
yeah, or a similar pattern of problems or whatever.
And it's neat seeing, this community kind of gelling, before our eyes of,
Educational,
all
yeah.
educational podcasters, together and, doing
I mean, it's obviously not all of the ones in
not
the world,
all the ones
but
in the world, but everyone here is
an
interested in
educator.
educational podcasting. And so, people are meeting each other and, communities
setting
are
up
forming. and-
setting up networks that are going to,
Yeah.
and I don't like informal networks that are going to continue past this if they haven't already been established.
And you get people that are showing up that are podcasters. They're not even on panels or giving talks either. They're actually just coming to listen, which is even cooler. 'Cause
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
just you're coming because you're going to be doing
Because you're
something.
doing something.
Because you're talking at Harvard.
Yeah,
Like,
so why
people
would you
are
not-
actually
yeah.
coming to listen to people talking at Harvard to learn.
Yeah.
So it's a give and take sort of
Yeah.
thing. It's been a lot of fun. The talks have been tremendous, and the panels. The linguistics panel was so much fun. You guys had such a good rapport.
Yeah, that was a
I guess
great
you kind of
group of
have to
people.
be that type of way to do linguistics.
You have to be good and nice and good at talking.
You have to be funny. You have to be funny and to make linguistics
interesting.
Interesting. Not that it's not.
No, but I think that's going to be
interesting,
that's
but-
actually going to be. I mean, it's actually not surprising that that's a feature of all these panels because everybody here is taking something that in some way is considered dry by somebody out there and trying to make it interesting to people who aren't necessarily interested in it, right?
Yeah.
Like that's literally what educational podcasting is, whatever the kind of education, whether it's curriculum based and school based or totally just general knowledge or whatever. So that means is we've got a whole bunch of people giving panels who are all good at communicating complicated ideas in interesting ways. So unsurprisingly, panels have been pretty good. Like that's a good setup for it to happen. So,
And a common theme with most of the podcasters that talk about their experience is, I started this podcast and I thought it would just be a handful of enthusiasts listening to me.
just the niche people.
The
who
niche people,
cared
like
about
me
this
with the
one thing.
grease. I was like,
Who else really cares
I
about this?
thought the most people would listen to it were grad students for comps. Because I know a lot of people that listen to Mike Duncan's Rome podcast for that to learn about Rome.
It was a
They're
useful
like,
way to keep.
You have
that all-
philologists trying to learn history at the I don't want to say last minute, but
No, but trying
they're
to
learning for
cram
comps,
in
yeah.
a bunch of stuff
So-
that is tangential to what they're really learning.
So
yeah.
I thought, they'll do that for Greek history,
Yeah,
and then I was
and
like,
it'll be useful. That'll be
and
great.
It'll be useful because I learned Greek history, and I can at least help other people since I'm no longer in the field. And then you get like people in like 170-ish countries around the world. It's like we're listening because Greek history is fun, and I never knew it before. And I'm like, mind blown,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
like that type of reach. Yeah, like you're saying, you're communicating something to people who are not traditionally, who haven't had an interest in something, and now they have an interest,
or they had a
'Cause they didn't know.
generalized
Yeah.
interest that that's a thing I kind of am interested in, but have never up to this point had the chance to, or the time to, or whatever to deeply pursue it. Because when you're at school, if you are lucky enough to go to school for university or whatever, it's a really tiny window. You don't know when you're doing it how lucky you are to have this time to, because at the time it just seems hellish. But you have the luck, you have the chance to pursue this. Once you're out of school, though, for most people, you never get the chance to deep dive on stuff anymore. Life takes over, and you can't do it. And I think that's one of the things people find so wonderful about these podcasts, like yours and so many others, is they can fit it in to the bits of their life that they never really get to do usually.
Yeah, you can listen to podcasts when you're folding your laundry
Yeah.
or walking your
As
dog.
people keep saying.
I do. Well,
I do all the housework. The only reason I do any housework at all is because I listen to
Exactly.
podcasts. If I couldn't listen to podcasts, I wouldn't do any housework. I do very little anyway.
I would wear dirty clothes. My laundry would never get done. No.
So this is where we zoom virtually back to our homes and pick up the conversation again from different parts of the world.
Drinking different drinks, of course.
Of course. All right. So we are resuming this conversation a little bit later. It is now, I don't even know. Oh, Tuesday. That's right. It's election day. We're ignoring the election and recording remotely because we weren't able to finish our discussion on Saturday due to the overabundance of things to do. Too much stuff to do. So we thought we'd finish off just debriefing.
And of course, we have fresh drinks.
Oh, yes, of course we do. Or at least we do. Ryan, did you get yourself something since we can't offer you anything at this point?
I have a glass of wine.
That is very moderate and restrained of you. And appropriate. Well, in honor of you, I'm just having a glass of mastiha, which is a Greek liqueur made with mastic, flavored with mastic, and some lemon and a nice cube.
I have red wine. That's a color.
That's a color.
Very good.
There you go. See, perfect. And Mark?
I have a vodka martini, which, it's like a James Bond drink. So, you're a spy, right? That's appropriate.
Very much.
Shh. Yeah.
Right. So yes, we went with a little looser organization of drinks tonight. And I'm also coming down with a cold, which is a clear legacy of the conference.
Mm-hmm. It's a time-honored tradition of getting the conference cold.
Conference cred. Yep.
Yeah, my throat is a little sore.
Well, I was definitely very throaty and raspy after the weekend, but that was in part from just talking too much in too many loud places. But today it went another degree. All right. So when we last spoke, we were talking about the panels that we ourselves sat on or moderated. But what I thought we could do now is we don't need to go through like session by session every other panel we each saw, but maybe we can talk about what the highlights, particular things that stood out, panels that you particularly enjoyed, talks that you particularly enjoyed. And then we can talk about our own talks briefly. So Ryan, what panels did you want to highlight?
Well, the only other panel that I went to other than mine and yours was one other that you guys were involved in. Mm-hmm. The history panel. It was very informative. It was neat to see a couple of the podcasters like Patrick Wyman that I know from social media and I've listened to his podcast. Mm-hmm. But overall, I kind of felt like I didn't get a whole lot out of it, just because it was more geared towards less geared towards independent podcasters and more geared towards like the methodology and the podcasts that have professional backing, which are great. They do a good job, but I felt like other than like listening to what they had to say, it's just, I don't know, me individually, I didn't get much out of it. Other people, maybe.
Yeah, you couldn't apply it to what you were doing as well.
Yeah, but a lot of it was, we have 4 PhDs, like the backstory. They're like, we have 4 PhDs that do American history, and they talked about their story and how they're backed by financial. They have a huge budget with researchers and producers and all that sort of stuff. And I was like, man, I wish I had producers and researchers. Yeah, not so much researchers, because I actually enjoy the research, and I don't think I could do a podcast where I wasn't the one putting everything together. But I definitely would like an audio, like a sound producer or sound engineer, whatever they're called. I should also caveat that as well with that room was super bright and I had developed a headache at that point. So maybe my attention span wasn't quite as good as it should be. I guess I should backtrack and talk about who the panelists were. So it was Backstory, which it's a professional podcast, radio style stuff with PhDs are all the hosts. And then there is Ben Franklin's World, which is also sponsored by a university. Or Liz Covert had I believe she's at William and Mary. She has a position where like she does a podcast with the university. It wasn't like that initially. And then Patrick Wyman is with Wandery. He does Tides of History. His podcast is really good. So it's those three are like professional big company or universities. They have backings, that sort of stuff. And then you have Emily Prokop, who does the story behind. I felt bad for her quite a bit on the panel because everyone's like, oh, we have all so and so and so, and she's like, I do this all by myself. It was funny, but the contrast was glaring, I should say. I feel like they could have did it like a more of an even split. It felt like most of the questions were lobbed at, and it's not her fault or their fault. Felt like most of the questions at the panel were lobbed towards like the professional, quote unquote, professional podcasters. Yeah. And since that's not me, I mean, I feel like I am a professional in what I do, but not in a professional.
You don't have professional resources.
Resources. I just felt like, I don't know, didn't get as much out of that as I would have liked, considering I do a history podcasting panel. But it was great to see people whose podcasts I listen to, like Patrick's and Emily's.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I want to propose going forward to next year, because we've just received an email saying that they're definitely planning for next year, which is great, that I really do think there should be at least one panel, maybe a set of panels about sort of living independently, like being aimed at and with both big and small independent podcasters who do it entirely by themselves or maybe two people, like big and small, meaning like people with lots of listeners and people with not very many listeners on the same panel talking about what they do and giving tips and tricks and commiserating. Like, I think that would be something, because I agree that there were a fair number of times when I felt like the things that were being talked about were applicable to, as you say, professional or large teams or whatever, and not so much to the independent podcasters. And the thing is, it's the independent people who don't have people to help them already. All the the people with the big teams have big teams. So it's good for them to get together. I'm not saying it isn't, but it's not as absolutely desperately necessary for them to find somebody else to talk to.
Yeah, I agree. It was great to learn from them, but there was most of the other panels I was at, there was a pretty even split. So I don't want.
No, it's just something to think about going to next year.
It was just on that one panel.
Yeah. So, Mark, what else did you see on the Friday? Because we also only saw one other panel each.
I mean, I think the other thing that we haven't talked about is like the keynotes.
Oh, that's true.
And
yes,
the Friday keynote I thought was really good.
Yeah.
I learned a lot of stuff from that.
The morning one? Or
the morning one.
Right. So we went to different morning keynotes. Okay, Mark, tell us about the keynote you saw then.
So, well, first of all, there was Diane Moore.
Yes.
And
we saw that one as well. Yes.
Yeah.
So they split, just for people listening, I guess they had so many people they wanted to talk that they couldn't do them all. So they split us into two for the opening keynote. And Diane Moore spoke at both and then somebody else did the other keynote in each.
And I thought one of the points that Diane made that I thought was really good was about why podcasts in particular work the way that they do, because it's audio only and it makes you focus on one sense, right? You're only
one
getting
element,
one element, and therefore requires it kind of gets the listener to be more active in the process, right? You're more engaged because you have to sort of
you fill in the rest.
You're
filling in stuff.
Yeah. And I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah,
and
I agree,
something that podcasters should keep in mind.
Yeah, as opposed to video, for instance.
Yeah.
And I suppose in a similar way to what text does, where you have to fill in visuals and audio. So you're filling. Yeah. No, I thought that was really good. I liked her talk a lot as well. She spoke about empowering agency as one of the things that so she talked about critical education and why how podcasting can be involved with that. And I didn't bring my notes with me, so I don't, because I did write them down, but empowering agency in the listener and inspiring empathy were two of the things that she said the podcasting was particularly good at. And I agree. The agency, because you're such an, as you say, you're actively participating in listening and creating the experience, and there's such a strong link. And then empathy, because of that strong link to a human voice, which is so crucial, and we respond differently to a human voice than we would to any other way of being educated. And then there was one more, and I can't remember what it was. She had 3 points. I did take a bunch of notes, and I am going to sit down and look through them again. They were more about sort of philosophical approaches to what you want to do with education,
Right.
than they were with anything technical. But I thought that was a really nice way to start off.
They'll also be up on. Eventually, they'll get loaded,
Yes.
so
We can go back and
you'll
look
be
back
able
at them,
to
yeah.
re-listen.
Right.
I didn't take as many detailed notes on some of the key notes as I would have liked, knowing that I would be able to listen to them again. I was trying to
Just be there in the room. Yeah.
absorb it. Yeah, absorb it, which was great then, and I learned a lot then, but my recall right now is like,
Yeah. I sort of went back and forth. So I took good notes that first session, and then it sort of went back and forth.
Yeah. It was same with me.
And then who was the other? But Liz Covart was talking.
Liz Covart was talked in the second part, and she gave a really good history of educational sound recordings. So it wasn't just podcasts. She went right back to early radio,
Right.
which is really fascinating.
Mhm.
And so she sort of traced the steps of the development and focused particularly on, the kind of institutional
Stuff that was connected to universities or colleges or schools.
universities or private corporation, or who was doing the material and what that kind of how that directed the history and how it went. And so early on there were some universities involved, one in particular, University of Nebraska in the 20s did classes over radio, and you could it was like a MOOC basically. You could have actually graded material and so forth.
Right.
And they got kind of crowded out by the kind of corporate world. So that kind of programming got relegated to poor time slots or poor frequencies that didn't carry very far.
Right. Because they weren't making money in the same way that commercial shows could make. Right.
And then when the networks got involved, they didn't turn to the universities to produce the content. They did their own sort of in-house stuff.
Right.
Or, the American networks would turn to state-run stuff from outside of the US. So they would buy programming from the CBC or the BBC.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because there was state-run programming in those countries,
Exactly.
and not in the US,
And not in the
because
US
the
at
US
that
doesn't
time.
do that.
No.
There's still not state-run stuff.
No.
I mean,
no,
NPR is
that's
not
true.
state-run.
Even NPR is not state-run. Yeah. So.
I mean, it may be supported in some places through taxes and stuff, but it's not a state-run broadcaster. Yeah.
And so I guess that history kind of explains why. I don't know if it fully explains why. I don't know, but it is the reality that universities today are kind of dragging their feet on, embracing podcasting.
They have not
as
had a
thing.
continuous tradition of audio education.
They have not,
had one,
Yeah.
it would have been easier to transition directly into podcasting as the medium, as the technology changed. But they got out of that business.
That's actually something that Liz brought up on the history panel that we just talked about. Like, she actually was thinking that projecting in the future that universities will get into the game more now that it's becoming popular. But then Patrick pushed back on that and was talking about, like, that may be true, but they missed the boat.
Yeah, I really do.
4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
They missed the chance that they could have harnessed it. Now you have these big media companies that have a hold of it. I mean, people or academics and people affiliated with universities will be able to use it for public outreach, and that's great. But if you're going to harness it for the media power that it could have, they've missed the boat on that. And that was a point that really I kind of resonated, it sticks in my head, obviously. So
yeah, no, I agree. I think there was an opportunity for them to sort of take to say, we're gonna, like, for individual universities to have said, we're going to make a hub. We're going to be a hub for people. We're going to put resources behind it, and we're going to get professors involved, and we're going to do some courses that way. But we're also going to do a bunch of sort of public-facing stuff, and we're going to figure out how to make it count as scholarship by like having people review podcast episodes to make sure they're not horrible, and like they set up the mechanisms for that and make it part of what a professor can do as part of their scholarship, and then make it a thing that when you think, I want to find out if there's anything interesting on an 18th century American history. Well, obviously I'll go check the university that has the history hub. That could have been a thing, but it's not, and now it's not going to be. Even if universities get much more behind it, and they can certainly take up space in the realm now. That's not a missed opportunity, but they can't be
the leaders.
The leaders.
No,
that's passed them by, and that's too bad.
Yep.
And I think it's important to point out that certainly some of that blame, goes to administrations, but it's also as much the fault of senior faculty who are suspicious of,
yes, it is. And the individual responsibility should be borne, but also those senior faculty were constructed by a world like it's a circular
systemic
thing.
It's a systemic problem. It's not just individuals, but
people not enough people tried, broke that mold or pushed back hard enough early on.
It's sort of easy to blame administrators, and certainly there are.
I don't blame administrators. I blame. I do. I always blame administrators, but and more sort of blame almost the institutional
inertia
and the whole basic premise of peer-reviewed scholarship and tenure and promotion, and just how difficult all those things are. But yes, you're right. People who weren't in favor of public scholarship even when it was done in other media. Yeah. That's they did not make things better. Well, interestingly, the speaker who we had in some ways did also talked about some history, but he talked more about history online, of scholarship and academia online.
Oh, okay.
And so he went back to blogging.
Oh, yeah, which certainly had its day.
Yeah, and he talked about how, and I've forgotten his name. Oh, no, I haven't. It's Dan Cohen. Yeah.
Dan Cohen.
And he spoke about how when blogging started and when academics embraced blogging, which obviously, again, not all of them did by any means, but those who did, blogs performed this really valuable service of what he called pulling back the curtain on academic work by demonstrating the process as well as the final result, and removing the he talked about how when you write for journals and for academic scholarship, you're trained to obfuscate everything that comes before the final result. The whole point is you're like, here is this brilliant thought and here is this support for it, but none of the here's how I came to that brilliant thought.
Right.
Here's the work, and here's all the mistakes I made, and here's all the and what was nice was that he seemed to me to be talking from a humanities perspective, which was nice because it's easy to talk about those things from a science, like here's the 15 failed experiments I did, but from a humanities perspective, the sort of struggle that you face.
He was a professor of history and
exactly. So he was coming from that perspective, so it was easy for me to kind of feel connected to what he was saying. But he said that blogging was a way that people, they talked about ideas as they were forming, and they wrote about the writing process, and they wrote about their journal, submissions and their rejections and their thises and their that's and their teaching, and all of this pulling back the curtain, humanizing the process of academia, making it real, and removing that authorial expertise, sort of speaking from on high, that comes when you just have the result and not the process, and making it clear that academics are just people helping to at least advance the notion that academics are not some specially gifted sort of people who can do this, but people who he used the analogy of magic tricks. A magic trick you can do because you put in literally hundreds of hours. How did he phrase it? You have put more practice time in than seems humanly possible. You have practiced it 18 hours a day, and while that is technically possible, it doesn't seem like anyone could have done that. So that even if you're told how the trick is done, it's still impressive because the sheer perfection of the skill. And he said, and the thing is, what scholarship is often a magic trick where you don't see the hundreds of hours of practice. You only see the end result. But the blogs pulled back the curtain on the practice. And so then he said, the point of that is to take us forward into podcasting. That's what podcasts can do. that's what podcasts can now do. We don't blog so much anymore, but podcasts allow you to tell the story behind the final result in all sorts of different ways. I mean, he was talking in particular about, he does interviews with authors of books and finds ways to sort of get them to humanize their results and things. But I think that that's a larger point. And I thought that was really good. It was really well phrased, and it kept coming up. People kept who'd been at that talk kept bringing up that metaphor of pulling back the curtain or not, or to how much you want to do that in any given podcast. And I thought it was really good.
And yet I remember getting questioned rather critically about blogging
Oh,
when
yeah.
I was on the job market.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, you're in the same way that people have been critical about podcasting. Oh, yeah. Blogging was not by any means accepted by everyone, but he was coming at it from the perspective of, here's why blogging was great, and this is why podcasting is. He was speaking to people who already like podcasting.
Yes,
He was speaking to podcasters. He was not making the argument to non-podcasters about why you should podcast. He was, I think, trying to help us coalesce in our head what it is that's special about podcasting, why it's different than scholarship in other forms. He talked about genre a lot,
Right.
and how blogging was a genre, and now podcasting is another genre, and scholarship is itself another genre, and why you need to think about how podcasting differs from formal scholarship so that you can do it well. So he wasn't trying to make the case to people who didn't believe academics should podcast.
Right.
He was making the case to people who do about what they're doing, and I felt it was helpful to me to help me coalesce what it is that we're doing.
Right.
And he talks about, you guys have this expert in your fields and and you bring that to the podcast, but he differentiated the difference between the academic side of the things and the public history sort of podcasting side of the things, because in the academic side, it's you have footnotes, you're basically trying to impress your peers, where on the podcasting public history side of it, it's more about putting it in, you're using words that you wouldn't use on the academic side, and you're making it more accessible and more human sounding, so to speak. Well, I mean, I'm getting better at it now. At first, I was really terrible, where I was very academically sounding, and now it's more geared towards, I don't want to say layman, but people, more of a story where you can break it down, where if I were to write a paper about it, I would not use the type of words and the type of phrases and the type of, just the way I would describe it. It would be a little more structured, and you wouldn't have to explain things as much, because it would be understood that people understand, that your audience, your peers would understand exactly what you're telling them. Like, I don't have to go off on these explanation of digressions.
But then it wouldn't be your podcast.
So he was talking about, he interviewed someone about nanotechnology for his podcast, and he was trying to get her to explain it, but not in a way that you would explain it in academic
somebody
setting.
else who also knew about nanotech.
Yeah, exactly. So get her to describe what she would do in a day in a lab. And I don't know what her name was. I didn't write it, but I guess just listen to his podcast. Anyway, and she digressed into a discussion of how making nanosensors actually looks a lot like making salad dressing. So you're like literally mixing various oils and ingredients together to make the right blend.
And then you shake it, and it like comes together into these little tiny things. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he's like, I can understand this now, and you're laughing at it, and you would never see that explanation happen in like an article or something. You can explain things better on an audio form podcast. You can make it relatable and understandable. That was his whole point.
Yeah, exactly. So he was an example of how he was trying to sort of humanize this really interesting, incredible work that was being done. But normally when it's written about and communicated, it's communicated to other people who already know how the technology works, people who already know how to do most of it, and that's just communicating the one new thing. And that doesn't work for communicating to a general audience who don't already know all the other stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I thought that started everything off on a really nice note.
Right, yeah.
You both, it sounds like yours as well, but ours definitely, I felt quite sort of inspired that we were doing good stuff, as a group walking out of there.
Well, it's a good thing we split our forces on those.
You and I, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that was what we had a grand plan to do that for all of the sessions, but 2 of the sessions we were both, well, I could have not gone to the language and linguistics one because I wasn't on that panel.
Yeah.
But I really did like hearing from the other people.
It was good. It was
a good panel.
So,
So, yeah.
I enjoyed it.
So the 1 o'clock session or whatever you didn't go to because you were recording with Lexitecture, which we will tell you all about that when it comes out, that podcast where you did a recording with them. Okay, what did you do? What did you see?
I went to the panel on ethics. On
did
podcasting
you?
and ethics.
I did want to hear about that actually.
Well, it kind of made me feel bad about myself. No, some of it was like the ethics of like being transparent about your sources, transparent about how you go about it, and it was also ethics involved with monetizing the podcast. It was a good discussion, but I don't feel like I got much out of it simply because well, I do have a Patreon and I do run ads and I do make money off of it. And the one guy was like, the guy asked a question. He's like, "What do you guys feel about running ads from Audible because they have Amazon? They're backed by Amazon and they do have terrible worker benefits." And I was like, "Well, I run ads from Audible." I was like, "Oh,
Yeah. So it was more sort of about like how you should do financing and that sort of thing. Was it? Was that the ethical points they were focused on?
It seemed like only one of them on the panel was like a humanities education-based podcaster. It looked like one of them was like a current news education sort of podcaster, right. And then the other one was doing science. She has a master's in biology, and she's basically her podcast. And I can't remember off the top of my head right now, something about Zika and.
Oh, okay, right.
Anyway, she's taking questions that people want to know, and then she takes the science questions and breaks it down into episodes that people can understand it better.
Okay.
And like her thing about ethics was, they were talking about like monetizing it, and I guess her opinion was she was against it because we already with our taxpayer dollars pay for the science information.
Right.
So
okay. Yeah.
She feels like it shouldn't be something that you have to pay again for this information just because we're not providing it in a layman type of understanding for people to get.
Okay, yeah. No, okay. So yeah. So I mean those are important questions, but not going to be as applicable to every podcaster necessarily.
Yeah. It wasn't a waste of time. It was a fun discussion. It was a fun, interesting discussion. It was interesting to hear other people's takes on it, but it wasn't anything that was applicable to me because,
Yeah, well, I mean, and also different context. Like I could imagine asking the question, if you are, say, a professor who is supported by your university to produce a podcast, would it then be reasonable to run ads? I think that's a different situation, right?
I would say that would have been great to have that sort of different views on the panel as well. They're all independent podcasters.
So then you're asking different questions. So, these things, it's good to hear different perspectives and then to keep moving forward. I think a lot of questions that were raised this weekend need to keep being addressed. Like, I don't think there was a lot of things where we were like, all right, done and dusted. We figured that one out. We're done. It was very much about bringing conversations together to start conversations rather than to sort of figure out where we're at. So, yeah. So I didn't go to anything at one.
But I think you must have done because you weren't with me. I was.
No, I went to community building. That's what I went to. I went to community building. And it was a little bit like what you've been talking about, Ryan. It was interesting, but basically everyone on the panel was like, the way I build community for my podcast is I go out in person and I do live shows and I meet my audience.
What's their definition of community?
Well, I mean, that's where they sort of started with community is, one person said community, what the moderator asked, what's the difference between community and marketing? And they said, marketing is where you get your brand in front of people so that they'll go check out your podcast. But community is where it's interactive, where you are giving them something and they're giving you something back and you are responsive to. And one of them said they had a very, very sort of strict definition of community, which is community are only those people who care enough about you that they will do something, they'll bring you soup if you're sick. And that might be a virtual thing, but something equivalent to that. So that's a very tight view of community where there's mutual.
What? This isn't Mayberry.
Well, maybe it could be that. I mean, that person was somebody who runs a chaplaincy podcast. That was Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. So obviously that community, which is about how chaplaincy works, is going to have a different interaction with its community than some are going to. But even so, like one of the other persons was the astronomy cast person, another person was Renaissance history, English Renaissance history. So, they weren't all podcasts like that, but they still basically, essentially, they all said, well, the only way to build community is to get out in face-to-face and meet people. And I thought, no, I know how to build community face-to-face. I'm good at
We're
that.
talking about podcasts here.
If I could get face-to-face with people who listen to my podcast, I could build community with them. That I know how to do that. We're humans. We're good at that. What I need to know is
how do you do it?
How do you do it when you can't meet them face to face?
When you're podcasting from a
remote place. Well, and also, how do you
get
to? Christine was there from Footnote on History, and she said, but how do you? But you can't get out and do live shows and meet people face to face until you have an audience that wants that from you.
That's true. Yeah. So how do you do it when you're smaller?
So how do you do it when you're smaller? How do you develop a community who's interested in meeting you face to face? Now, there was some discussion of some of the other, they talked about what platforms they were on, and they talked about how they, what kind of rules they develop for how much they react or interact with or respond to people. And, but a lot of it was sort of, here's how I keep my boundaries strict, and here's how I protect myself against troll. And, it was a lot of sort of people who have large communities talking about how they manage dealing with their communities. That was not building. And they talked a little bit, each of them, about how that started, but not. They all had very difficult to replicate origin stories,
right?
that didn't really translate.
Was there another panel on podcast growth, or was this that one as well?
No, there was another one about podcast growth. This was very much about community building. It wasn't about audience growth. It was about how you sort of build obviously they are connected, and they did talk about how those elements are connected, but it was more about how you build and so one of the things that I thought was useful was they said, one of the things when you're building the community is you want to find a way to build a community who can speak to one another, who meet because of you, but who meet with one another. So whether that's like a Slack community or a Facebook page or a Facebook group or on Twitter through hashtags, or they do meetups in cities, or like whatever they do. If all they're doing is interacting with you, it's not a community. If they're interacting with one another, then and it's facilitated by you in some form, either actively or just because you're the focus of interest that they find their commonality, then that's a community. And I think that that's a really good way to think about it and makes a lot of sense. But I still don't feel, and please, listeners, if you disagree with me on this, let me know, please. But I don't really feel like we're in a position where I feel like we, maybe this is my lack. Maybe we haven't worked hard enough to develop a community around us. But I don't feel like I'm the focal point of enough people's interest to be a community in that sense, So it was interesting to listen to. But again, in terms of takeaways, there were some, and that was probably the biggest takeaway that I had. But some of the other stuff I sort of thought, this is not applicable to my situation.
I don't think individual. I think it's very hard for individual podcasters to get a community in that sort of sense. It's sort of like on Facebook, they have podcast groups where listeners and podcasters come together and they discuss things and that sort of stuff. And I feel like that is more of the community. I could be wrong, but I have a listeners group that I'm involved with, people from my podcast as well. So if that's what they mean by community, then sure. But I don't know. I've never done a live show, and I probably will never do a live show. I make way too many bloopers.
And now this is just a transition between two parts of our conversation that were interrupted by the computer being weird. All right. So Friday night, we all went to a bar, probably. What did we do? No, we went to a museum and drank.
Yeah.
Well, we went to the pub and then for dinner.
Yeah, for dinner.
Yeah.
And then we went to the reception at the Museum of Natural History, or Natural History Museum at Harvard, which was very fun.
Is the Peabody Anthropology and Ethnography?
Oh, yes, of course. It was not the Natural History Museum.
Yeah.
There was some disagreement where to go, and Ryan was very smug.
Yeah, there's two different buildings, and I tried to lead you all to the right way, and nobody wanted to listen to me.
Because we were reading the program, which said the other thing. But anyway. But it was very fun.
Just call it intuition.
It was very fun and enjoyable. Yeah. It was just a good networking, chatting opportunity.
I was going to say, it was fun to just converse with everybody and find Especially, there's quite a bit of podcasters that I got to talk to that I only know from like Facebook
Yeah. Yeah.
podcasting groups.
Yeah.
So that was cool.
Yeah.
I feel like I learn. It's not even. I feel like some of the best parts of the weekend weren't even things that you learned from the talks or the panels. It was the community.
Yes.
We talked about this quite a bit
Mm.
when we actually recorded before, how podcasting can be lonely,
Mhm.
and the fact that other people are doing it and you are socializing with them. That was my best take out of the weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, just talking to other people who also cared about it, because I think one of the things is most of the time I can't talk to people about podcasting in my life because they don't know about it and they don't care. They might care in a general sense, but they don't care about the details. So
Mhm.
just being able to talk to people who also are interested in this thing, like not necessarily the topic, but in podcasting, was just nice. Just being able to sort of talk about it and not be constantly apologizing for talking about this thing nobody else knows about.
For sure.
All right, so Saturday. Saturday was a day that was open to the public, and everybody was giving individual panels, and then there were a number of keynotes.
Yeah. So to start the day, there were, I guess, two.
I don't know. None of us went to the keynotes, so there's really no point in us talking about it, right, Ryan? You didn't go to the opening keynotes either?
No, there was just the one keynote. That's right.
Yeah.
It was raining.
Yeah.
In the morning. And
I was out too late the night before.
Yeah, it was a slow moving morning.
Yeah, it was Nate DeMeo of Memory Palace.
Right, in the morning. And I'm sure it was very good. We just made an executive decision that we were not going to try to get there for that.
But there was at 10 o'clock
Mhm.
the start of the various
Panels. Oh, no, talks.
talks.
Talks, yeah.
Yeah.
So I went and saw the history footnoting talk with Christine and Elizabeth, and they talked about how they link their episodes to either current ones that they're doing or ones that they've already released to current events, and the way they sort of find a connection between things without trivializing either the modern or the historical event, but find ways of making the connection so that other people can make that connection and find their information interesting. And so that was interesting just to hear what they'd done, but it was also actually quite useful as a way to think about not just publicizing and drawing an audience, but also making what you're doing relevant in a way that it, not just because you want to get people to come and listen, but you want what you say to mean something to them. So using the connection to pop culture or to current events as a way into the information that you have to give them.
Right.
And I thought that was very useful. And you, Mark, where did you go?
I went to Doug Metzger's talk, What English Departments Leave Out. And I think the main thing that I took away, which is not necessarily the main
point he made,
main point he was making, but I think the main thing that I took away from that was it was almost like a call to action.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found it very inspiring. It's, I sort of came out of that thinking, yeah,
all riled up.
Yeah. So I think that's a very positive thing to take away there. But I guess one of the things that he touched on that I really understood where he was coming from is, this intense specialized reading that you do as a graduate student, kind of drilling down. I think the metaphor he uses with like drilling down on this, tiny point, while there's this, whole world of tempting literature out there
that you don't read.
And not only is it sort of tempting and exciting, but he also made the point that in a lot of ways, it's maybe more relevant. And he used this, the specific example of the field that he was trained in, American literature, I guess, of the 18th, 19th century, that what they knew was, they had that
you don't read in what your own authors read.
Yeah. And so they knew, they had this intense knowledge of the Bible, but when you study in an English department, American literature, that doesn't get covered in the same way.
Spend time on the Bible. Yeah.
And as he was, careful to point out, it's not that he disagreed with the value of, literary theory and all of these things that they do make you read in a graduate program, but that doing that at the expense of other stuff is maybe problematic and certainly not as enjoyable as being able to cast your net more widely. And so that resonated with me.
It's interesting because that's a very specific call to action for other people who are in an English department, which is you.
Yeah.
But I mean, as a call to action to a bunch of podcasters who
Yeah.
have no ability to affect English. I'm not in any way saying he shouldn't, but it's just sort of an interesting. It obviously links to his podcast, which is about
and that
filling
was the
those
focus of
gaps
his talk,
right?
is
It's
what
filling in
English
those gaps.
departments leave out.
That's what he
was focusing on,
and that his
moment,
podcast
but-
can fill the gaps is the point. So,
yes, and yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, that's very interesting.
One day when he finally gets there.
No, well, he is filling the gap. He's starting with the things
Yep.
that influence the people who influence the people who influence the people who influence
Exactly.
the authors you want to read. It's very simple.
Well, I mean, it's that thing where you start reading a thing and you think,
Oh, but what came?
but to really understand this, you've got to read the thing that lies behind
Mhm.
it. So you go read that. Oh, but to really understand that, you've got to
and
read
it's
this.
it's
other
funny
thing.
because
and pretty soon you're reading Gilgamesh.
yeah, exactly. That's the end of that. I mean, the funny thing about that is that
True.
in because of the field I'm in, we do that as a matter of course.
Right.
We read Latin poetry, and everybody expects us to read as much of what survives of what they read
Right.
as we can. So nobody would expect that you could read Virgil and talk about Virgil without having read Homer.
Right. Yes.
You would be considered
That would be
like
absurd.
just what is your point and what are you talking about?
Mhm.
And we can't read everything he read because
We don't
it
have
doesn't
it.
survive, but we spend hours trying to. So, but of course, that becomes exponentially harder the further you go forward in literature.
Yeah.
So, like, it's all very well to do that as a Latinist.
This
but
is why I like the early Middle Ages, because
literacy was nice and contained.
Yeah.
Not enough people were
and
writing.
we know exactly what manuscripts they had. So
they had access to, so you could just get it right
it's,
straight.
it's
Yeah.
pretty limited.
And what did you go to first, Ryan?
I went to Zoe Contis from Lutit. She gave a talk. She's a Greek archaeologist, and she gave a talk on artifacts that have been formally displayed in major U.S. museums. And she talked about a few things at the MFA since we were in Boston, as well as at the Met and the Getty, and a few other places. And then she also talked about these that have been exposed as forgeries, and then some, shall we say, questionable objects that are still on display today. And she talked about that sort of stuff. And it was pretty fascinating. I'm not an archaeologist, but I have a vague familiarity with Greek architecture, sculpture, and that sort of stuff. But a few of these you just learn about these objects. I didn't know much about the history of the object and some of the fakes. And yeah, it was fascinating. It was very visual, lots of images as you would expect. It was pretty good. I'm going to now be a little more skeptical when I look at certain objects in museums now and be like, I wonder if this is a real thing, especially when they don't have provenance or anything on their labels other than like found in Greece, acquired from so and so auction. It's like,
From a private collection.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'll be a little more skeptical now.
That's cool. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a big, it's really big in the news thing with those Dead Sea Scrolls from
Yes,
the
that's
Museum
right.
of the Bible right now.
Yeah.
But yeah,
And that there was a publication. There was Brill put out a whole book on it, didn't they?
or I think they are putting
putting
one
it?
out. I
Oh,
think that's
okay.
why the petition
That's why
saying
this
don't do
petition
it.
to kill the book, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I saw that that talk in the list or whatever, I was quite interested in that, but I didn't go to it. So it's
Good to hear about.
good to hear about it. Yeah,
You can listen
And
to
then
it
there
in
was-
a few weeks, I suppose.
Yeah,
right,
that's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
And that's the thing. We will post links to places where you can see whatever was filmed once they've processed it all and put it up. But it's
which I
going to
imagine
take.
will take a while because this
Yeah.
must have a ton of data.
I know, it's ridiculous the amount of material they must have because they were filming everything.
It should be noted, if we hadn't already, that there was way too many cool talks and not enough
Yeah.
time slots. And like there was like two.
Yeah.
There were several ones that had 3 or 4, maybe even 5. I think they had like 10 going at one time, right? Or was it 8?
Yeah.
And
Well, I
there
think
was, like-
maybe 8 talks, and then there was like workshops and other things going on at the same time too. Yeah, it was too much.
like I made sure to go to all the classics talks because I thought those were going to be the underrepresented of all of the other stuff just because it's classics. And
Yeah. And I went to some of them, but sometimes there was some other stuff I had to or really wanted to go to. Yeah. Then there was lunch, and you went to and so Mark and I interviewed Kevin. We went and had some food, and then we interviewed Kevin Stroud. We interviewed him first, and then we went and had lunch.
Yeah, that's right.
From the History of English podcast. So we skipped out on the mid-morning
main stage,
the main keynote, which was Dan Carlin. You went to that though, Ryan?
I did go to that. It was very good. Dan is a very charismatic guy, as you have to be in order to do 6-hour long podcasts and have millions of people listen to them, or however many he has. It was very fascinating. It was just a Q&A. They had an initial discussion, and then he took questions from the audience that varied from how, what was it like starting the podcast in the early days, because he got in there very early, and then there's very specific questions about like World War II history because he did a series on that. Yeah, it was good. It should be noted that Zach was talking when he asked Dan to come to this. Dan Carlin was very enthusiastic, and he was so for it. And as soon as Dan said yes, everybody else came.
Right.
Everybody else jumped onto it.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like that domino effect. So it was because people were like, I want to come see, or Dan Carlin's here. Oh, I'm definitely coming.
It gave it legitimacy for people, I'm sure. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, and it's huge that he got that in the first conference, someone of his stature. And by the time they found that out, it was a lot of people wanted to come. A lot of other podcasters even wanted to come, and they just couldn't. They couldn't make it fit into their schedule on such short notice. And so it seems like there's going to be a lot of buzz for next year as well.
Yeah.
You could see the amount of times they kept changing the schedule because they kept adding people.
Yeah. Well, and this is the thing. It's one of obviously I wanted to go to this for lots of reasons, but I do think there is going to be a whole lot more people who come next year, I suspect. And I think there's going to be, unless they can't increase the panels exponentially.
No.
I think there's going to be more competition, for lack of a better word, for slots, and bigger podcasters and people with more clout in the industry and stuff will probably end up getting some of those. And I don't begrudge, I understand it. That's how it works. But I think being able to come this year as independent podcasters
was important.
And because we got to come this year and present, and then also because it means we presented in the first year and we're part of this. We got in at the ground floor. And, yes, other bigger names will be there next year, but I feel like it'll be easier to try to kind of wedge ourselves in still be part of it as more than just an audience.
Right.
Because we were able to be part of it this year.
Yeah.
Now, I know that Zach and Doug and Joseph want to be as inclusive as possible, but there are just going to be limits on what they can do just because of, if it was this crowded this time, just think what it's going to be next time.
Yeah. It's going to have to be 3 days probably.
I would think so. Yeah. Then there were some various things in the afternoon. I don't know. I think maybe we shouldn't try to go through every single thing. Was there a particular highlight of the afternoon for you, Ryan? Other than your own talk. We'll come back to that in a moment.
Giant ants.
So I think we happened to be all in the same talks for the most part.
Yeah, that's true. In the afternoon. Yeah.
I went to a different one in the first
slot. Yes.
But after that, I think we were.
And then
even you were with me. You were with me for Rob's of History in the Making, right?
Yeah.
When we talked about Athens, I thought that was actually really well done.
Yeah, he did a good job. So that's the History in the Making podcast. Yeah, he did a good job sort of crafting a talk that had a point to it. Yeah, and it was good.
He started out very biblical, and I was like, how is he going to connect this to ancient Athens?
Yeah, but he did it.
It was it was very well. I'm not going to spoil it. I'll let people go and listen to it, but it was I was like, this is curious. He's a good storyteller. He likes to fashion himself as in the style of Dan Carlin. And I've helped him quite a bit with a lot of the ancient Athens stuff and giving him sources and stuff, because that was just one season of his podcast. He does a lot of other stuff, other different histories.
Yeah.
I thought that, I thought that was really well done. And then, of course, your guys' talk was pretty fun. It was cool to essentially see an episode in person, although you didn't get to cover all the colors and all the information that Mark probably wanted to cover as well.
I mean, we both had stuff we didn't get to, but yes, Mark had lots of stuff he didn't get to.
But you guys have another episode, or you guys already have an episode about that. So
Yeah, we actually have a whole series on
about
colors.
that,
We did.
yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. We had like an individual episode on almost all of those colors, and then we tried to pull the highlights together for a 20-minute talk. So it was doomed to failure from the very start. There was no question about that. Yeah.
What colors did you guys end up covering? It was
Black,
white,
red, and very briefly blue.
Blue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I have lots of things to say about this, but that's okay. It was fine.
Yeah.
We knew that would happen, and I think we managed to hit on some fun things people didn't know, that was really what we were hoping to get across, was some things that would surprise people about where words came from or what they meant. Well, and I enjoyed your talk, of course, Ryan, I really liked the tie.
Thank you.
Of like, here's why Herodotus is interesting, and here's how it influenced the way I do my podcast.
And I love your characterization of Herodotus as that guy at the bar.
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know what this says about me, but I think I would love that guy.
Well, yeah.
This is maybe not
Me
a
too.
positive reflection on my personality or not, but I would just love that guy.
Well, Mark, on Saturday night, you became that guy.
He's the guy at the bar who has stories to tell, but they're interesting stories.
Yeah.
That's the key, right?
That's the key.
There's another guy at the bar who has stories to tell, and they're all about how his truck got stuck in a ditch one time. And that's the guy that you don't want to get stuck sitting next to.
No, you want to get
want the
stuck
guy-
with the guy who tells you about giant ants who dig for gold.
And you're like, you sit there going, sure, buddy, I'm sure, I know you're making this up, but just keep going because it's great. Yeah. And then we motored over to our talk, and we did our talk, and then we split up again. I went off to Ryan and I went to listen to Rhiannon Evans talk about Emperors of Rome podcast, and Mark, you went to Kevin's.
Yeah.
And before that,
I'd gone to Mignon's talk in the first
slot, the grant when we were at
Yeah.
Rob Sims, yeah.
which was a great sort of defense of descriptivism.
Right, which is nice.
Yeah, it was
Before
great.
we met her, I wasn't sure because, she's grammar girl and she gives tips on how to write better. And I thought, oh, is she going to be all about like pedantry and
Mhm.
judging other people's grammar and stuff?
That's exactly the perception that she addressed. Is
Right.
like you probably would expect me to, and that's when she pulled out the giant red pen,
The inflatable red pen.
No, but so it was brilliant. It was really good.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I don't know, Ryan, did you see the pictures of her with her inflatable red pen and her pet peeve?
I didn't see the pictures. Are they on Mark's social media, or
Yeah,
is this
probably.
somewhere
They are, yep.
else?
I don't remember if I put them up. Yeah, I think
I'll have to
they
double
might have
check.
been in the set I put up on Facebook too. I'm not sure. Yeah, they're entertaining. And then so we went to Rhiannon Evans, and I thought her talk was. I mean, there was a nice theme. One of the ones we didn't mention was after Robson's and before Ryan, there was Drew, and I don't remember his last name, from The Way Home. The road to self-improvement is the way home. The way home is the road to self-improvement, and self-improvement is the way to home. Anyway, it's a podcast about 18th century American history. And he talked, like the footnote history people, about how to tie modern events to historical precedents. So there was like a theme there.
Mhm.
And then when we went and saw Rhiannon talking, she was also talking about the sort of dangers of drawing parallels between the ancient world and the modern world, but also the advantages of it, but like how you have to be nuanced about it and sensible. And the line they kind of try to walk with the podcast of, she said, everybody always wants her to say what Roman Emperor Trump is like. And she doesn't want to do that. It's too fast. She thinks that the comparison is facile and you lose nuance on both ends. You lose a full understanding of each. But on the other hand, everybody wants to do it. And so she kind of talked about how that works. And I thought that was really interesting. So there's a kind of theme through a lot of the panels that I saw. And Mark, what was the other one you
I
said?
was at Kevin Stroud's
Right.
talk, which I think was the most brilliantly structured of all of the Saturday talks that I went to.
It was quite formal, right? Like
It
it
was
was not
formal. So he
didn't-
was reading from a script.
Mhm.
And what he did is he told the history of the English language from the perspective of one word.
Mhm.
And so he started with the word in its Proto-Indo-European root and sort of touched on different stages as the word developed.
And don't give away the ending.
Yeah,
don't give away the ending
Spoiler
because it
alert.
might be on.
Yeah.
You can go watch it, right? So,
Yeah. And so he touched on all these various different, derivatives of that word and how they
Connected
gave
to
some
history
clue
at some
about
point,
what
yeah.
was happening in the history of the language at that particular time. And then he ended with a modern,
very relevant.
very relevant derivative of the word. And there was an audible gasp in the room when he said that word. And everyone went,
because it was so.
it was
Perfect.
like, it was so perfect.
I don't think we managed any audible gasps.
No.
I got some, pleased nods, but
Right,
yeah, no audible
yeah.
gasps.
And it was just so perfect.
We did get laughter, yes.
Yes.
You got some laughter.
It was a brilliant talk. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was thoroughly enjoyable and just so well constructed.
Well, I mean, that's what his podcast has always been good, but as he's been progressing through it, the last 20 or 30 episodes, the ones that have gotten really thematic.
Yeah.
He just like they are so well formed.
Yeah.
And he does such a
absolutely.
good job of weaving the story together. And yeah, so I'm not surprised, but I'm sorry I didn't see it.
It
So
was,
I will.
it was an experience.
Mhm.
It was
I will try
wonderful.
to catch it later. And then I guess there was one last keynote, which I also failed to go to. I was really bad at keynotes because we were coming back from Rhiannon's talk and I was slow and tired. And by the time I got back, she'd gone a little late. It was already happening. And I just sat in the hallway and talked to Rhiannon and her husband instead. But you went to that one too, Ryan, didn't you? You were so good. You attended everything.
I kind of went to that one.
Right.
I got there very late. I got there towards the tail end. You guys all went to one
Right.
more talk than I did yesterday. So, or on that Saturday, because I had to frantically get ready for mine. So technically, I'm not that good. But yeah, I went. I got to the tail end of it. It was just Zach
right, okay.
making his closing remarks. It wasn't anything. I mean, Zach's a good speaker. It was great, but
Right. He was
but it wasn't
wrapping up.
anything
Yeah,
like
he
it
was
wasn't like a.
wrapping up, yeah.
But I was there through the whole thing. And
Oh,
I heard
right.
the
Mark, you were there.
speaker.
That's
Yeah.
right. Sorry.
So it was Juleka Lantigua Williams.
Mhm.
So I hadn't been previously familiar with her work, so I didn't know all of the details about the specific project that she was using as the sort of example,
Mhm.
but it had to do with, looking at the perspective of Americans who have a criminal record and, what that means.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it was a kind of call to action. So the point of it all was about podcasting with intentionality. So really thinking about what you're doing when you make a podcast. What is the purpose of it? Who is your audience? What are you trying to achieve? What will you do if you get this result from it, and so forth.
Right.
And again, I found that kind of inspiring and
Mhm.
thought-provoking.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was a good talk.
Right.
Mhm.
Good. Well, I'm glad you were there to absorb it for us. And then we all went to the party. Ryan, you never did get to the other party you were supposed to go to, did you? You had a conflict. You had too many
No, I did
places to
not.
be, too many people who wanted to see you.
Yeah, it was not.
Yeah.
After I
Oh,
started at
indeed.
1, I was not leaving. It went
Yeah, I
down.
was at a bar and the first round was free and there was food. I realized afterwards that was the entirety of the food I ate, of course, all night was three
that first
three
plate of food,
squares
yeah.
of, I just had 3 squares of pizza.
Oh,
That's all I had.
I loaded my plate up kind of high.
No, I
There's still one plate, but
Yeah. I had 3 3 little squares of flatbread. They were very good,
Mm.
but yeah, it's not a full meal.
I had 2, so it was That's
Oh
I
yeah.
blame it on Mark. I tell everyone it was the linguist's
They do
fault.
lead one astray. I have long experience of that. Linguists lead you far astray.
But there was the mojito in particular, wasn't it, that you found nostalgic?
Not a mojito, but the mojitos.
Yes. I worked my way. I didn't work my way through the whole cocktail menu, but there were 3 interesting cocktails that I
Right.
tried of theirs, and then I just switched to Negronis and had Negronis. And the bartender, the guy who'd written the cocktail menu, was quite pleased that I ordered a Negroni, and we talked about Negronis and bitters and things like that for a little while. Later on, when it got a little quieter. But yeah, so it was a very fun party.
It was, yeah. And I met, people that night that I hadn't
Yep.
met before in the conference. So it was really, valuable.
Yeah, I think there was 140-ish podcasters there. That's not including people who, the audience. So it's obviously there's still some people there that I didn't get to meet because, there's just too many people and not enough time.
But yeah, I met some more people and had some fun and conversations while the band was playing jazz covers of Beatles songs quite loudly. So, it was a lot of yelling. I felt so bad for Kevin, whose voice was
Trashed by the...
Well, it was starting to go. He was already sucking on a cough lozenge by like the beginning of the party.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, it hurt to listen to him because it sounded so much like it was hurting so much.
Raspy
But,
and- yeah.
but he said, when I asked him the next day on Twitter, he said that it had recovered by the afternoon enough that he was speaking, which is good because a whole bunch of podcasters who went to 3 nights in a row of really loud yelling situations.
Yeah.
We're all supposed to be using our voices very carefully, aren't we? Yeah, it was great. And Doug was finally released from his duties enough to come and
kick back a little and
chat a bit and have a drink, which was good. Yeah.
That was probably my favorite part of the night. Just watching Doug in his natural habitat.
Release. And we talked to by that point Ryan Paulson of Lexitecture had to go back, though we saw him on the Thursday night, which was nice. But Amy was still there, and I sat and talked to her for quite a while, and it was just
it was a perfect way to end the conference, and just I regretted it on Sunday, but it was perfect.
Yeah, Sunday was a little rough.
I regretted only having 2 little mini pizza squares.
That's it. If there'd been more food involved on Saturday night, I think I would have been in a much better state on Sunday. But who knows?
But fortunately, you did get your microphone back, so that was important.
I did. I could barely keep my eyes open on the Uber ride to go get it, but I got my microphone back.
That's good. I'm glad. Yeah. Well, so, I mean, the final takeaway, I think we've said over and over again, was...
It was super useful.
And it was super invigorating and
I learned
inspiring.
A lot. And I was inspired and re-energized about the project. And,
it's worth doing.
It's worth doing
well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my one strongest desire is that the connections that we made not just slip away.
Yeah. Right.
Because that can happen if you don't have any reason to coalesce around it, for all the good intentions everybody had in meeting and everything. But particular connections and some of the conversations that got started at some of the panels and things like that, I think I need to make an intentional effort to make sure that those connections strengthen rather than weaken, and not just, by liking their tweets on Twitter. Something a little more than that. I'm not saying I'm not going to do that, but just not only that.
Right.
Well, and you can also listen to their podcast, the new podcast as well, and give them those downloads. I think I have like 10 new ones. I mean, more than 10, but I mean, like, definitely. Well, we'll see.
I've got a lot more that I'd like to listen to an episode of. I purse that I haven't pulled out and sorted yet.
So, how did this Sound Education conference compare to VidCon for you guys? With the caveat that it was its first installment.
Well, compared to EduCon, so we went to VidCon.
That would be the fair comparison.
We went to VidCon is the big YouTube thing, and it was overwhelming and terrifying in various ways, but interesting too.
Mhm.
But the one day before it was EduCon, which, like SoundEducation, was the first time that had happened.
Yeah.
EduCon was the first one,
Mhm.
and it was only educational video people, and it was a day of panels, not talks, but panels and community building. So in many ways, very
Very
similar
similar,
to,
yeah.
and put together by members of the community and mostly independent video makers rather than people who were with any kind of bigger companies. So I think the comparison was actually
Mhm.
in the same way. I think the biggest thing I felt was the, oh my goodness, you go through this too. Oh my goodness, it's so nice to be talking to someone who cares about this element. And the making connections to people and meeting people in real life whom I'd seen online only.
Mhm.
That, that was the best part of EduCon, and we came out of it really inspired.
Yeah. So I think in that sense, it was very similar.
This one was more formal and longer, more formal in like a sort of more academic-y formal in some ways. And it just went on longer. The EduCon
Yeah.
was only
So it
one
was
day. There was
more
just
of it.
more stuff.
Yeah.
Mhm.
In some ways, a wider range of types of things going on. Just a wider range of types of creators, perhaps.
And there were more concurrent
Events,
things
yeah.
going on at SoundEducation.
The other thing about EduCon was it was specifically not open to the public.
Yes.
Because some of the quite big creators were there, and they did not want to be dealing with fans.
Yeah. So it was completely restricted to people who did educational videos
And it was invitation only.
and invitation only.
So that was so it was very much about just the community of makers, which was good for that context because
you could then have real conversations with
and the people who find it in that context hard to be sort of normal people because they are too well known and there are too many people who want their time were able to participate. I didn't find that was a problem at SoundEducation. Some people had more fans than others, but it was not a problem. But I suppose that may be something that will, if more and more big names come, not that they'd have to make it.
It could be a problem down the
road. They may have to, like VidCon didn't used to have to segregate its video creators.
That has increased over the years.
Because VidCon itself, like anyone who was presenting on any of the panels was shepherded around the whole place behind curtains. Like they were never allowed to be out in public. They had to be always behind restricted zones so that no riots occurred.
One day I'll get to that level.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's going to be a while before the podcast world is quite like that, but I suppose it's possible in the long run.
One day.
So yeah, no, it was a good comparison though, I think, because they were both sort of an attempt to start to mark out territory in the wider medium, video or podcasting, that is specific to educational content, and to start to say, do we have particular problems or do we have particular concerns or community issues as an educational community that it's worth us talking about together? Both events where that was the sort of driving force behind them, I think. And it shows something about where the two media are in terms of how they're developing, that these both happened this year. So yeah.
It was an experience. It's really hard to put into words. It was just at least erudite words. It was. Well, I learned quite a bit from other podcasters, but also, as you mentioned, I'm just more rejuvenated now because I kind of hit a rut this past year in terms of my podcast. Most people won't know that, but I kind of just hit a rut, and I feel kind of. We'll see if that lasts, but I feel rejuvenated now. Well, not physically. I'm starting to get a cold.
Yeah, physically I'm a wreck, but emotionally I feel rejuvenated.
Yeah. Once I feel better, I'll be like, yeah, I'm gonna knock out all these episodes like I did in the first year of my podcast. But it was, and I'm excited to actually. I haven't really thought about it yet. I thought I was gonna do it on the plane ride home, but I was still kind of, frankly, hungover from the night before. But I haven't really sat down and just got back from work, but I haven't really sat down and put down a pen to paper or really processed like how I'm going to implement things that I've learned quite yet. That'll probably be something that'll happen a little later once you decompress from it. I'll probably go back and listen to some of the other panels that I missed when that one's finally ready. But try to implement some of the stuff you learned. Because, in the moment, some of the stuff might not seem relevant, but it could. You never know where it's going to spark ideas later.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I've been so interested in how the way I've been improving my podcast has just been a natural evolution. Oh, this sucked, or this didn't work, or this was, there hasn't been a whole lot of emulating from other people, for better or worse. I mean, it's good in the sense that I feel like I've done a lot of unique stuff. Because I'm not styling myself off of other people, but at the same time, it's good to like look and see what other people are doing, and then trying to improve what you're already doing, while staying true to what it is that you already do.
Yeah, basically, if you see something and think, "Oh, I didn't know I wanted to do that, but I do," or "Oh, this is like what I'm doing, but I could do it better this other way." That doesn't mean you're copying someone else or whatever. It just means you're learning. Yeah.
Well, Kevin really made me want to raise my game.
Yeah.
So, but that's good. That's, it's inspiring.
All right. On that note, I think we should let us all go and get some of this rest we also desperately need.
So I have one last question.
Okay.
Ryan, did your shoes survive?
Oh, yes, I have to rebuff them pretty bad this week. Luckily, I have a few weeks until I have to wear them again.
But they'll be okay.
Yes.
Okay, good.
These were your work shoes, as it were.
Yeah, my very very nicely buffed Air Force shoes. I had a fun weekend, and this is a fun conversation rehashing.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us and talking about it, because I thought it was nice to decompress and talk about it.
Sort of reabsorb that, the stuff that you learn at the time, and you sort of take it in, but getting to reabsorb it is, I think, really good.
I wish we could have finished this conversation in person, because it's fun to be part of it in person.
And at least we got a little bit of in time in person.
Yeah.
Well, we'll do it again next year.
Next
year we'll plan a little more time to sit and chat.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ryan. Again, his podcast, if by any strange chance you don't know it, is The History of Ancient Greece, and it is very good indeed. Thanks to Ryan for joining us.
Thanks, Ryan.
And we will be back soon.
In our next episode, it will be yet another interview that we recorded at the conference. So the next one is with Kevin Stroud of the History of English podcast.
And it's a little bit more of a focused discussion about his podcast and what he does. Again, if you don't listen to that podcast, I don't know what you're doing with your time, but it is fabulous. So we'll be back quite soon. Hopefully that will be out in a week or two, because we have it and we'd like you to hear about it while we're still fresh from this conference. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.
For more information on this podcast, check out our website, www.alliterative.net, where you can find links to the videos, blog posts, sources, and credits, and all our contact info.
And please check out our Patreon, where you can pledge to support this show and our video project. You can go directly to the videos at youtube.com/alliterative.
Our email is on the website, but the easiest way to get in touch with us is Twitter. I'm at Avensarah, AVENSARAH.
And I'm at Alliterative. To keep up with the podcast, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or to the feed on the website.
And if you've enjoyed it, consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It helps us a lot. We'll be back soon with more musings about the connections around us. Thanks for listening.
Bye.